First of all, I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm sorry our Vice Rector Pilar Trinidad couldn't do it, made it. But I'll do my best as moderator in such a privileged roundtable with such relevant speakers and organizers. Before presenting them, I'm going on to give them the floor. I would like, because there have been many problems with the link event, and we have already seen this conceptual video prepared for this occasion that couldn't be correctly watched in our first round table. Anyway, I would like to focus on the issue that concerns us, the new climate migrants, in the context or perspective that I understand is the one that has guided this event and its participants, that's its human security. The awareness of the relation among climate change and human security is nothing new. Indeed, in 1948, Fairfield Osborne already questioned when it will be openly recognized that one of the principal causes of the aggressive attitudes of individual nations and of much of the present discord among group of nations is traceable to diminishing productive lands and to increasing population pressures. So I think that maybe has to do with the video, and I haven't watched it before. However, as at the international institutional level, the discussion didn't arrive until 2007, when the United Nations Security Council held for the first time a debate on the impact of climate change on security. The end of the Cold War led to a shift in the concept of national security from a military defensive perspective to a broader concept in which non-military aspects, including economic, social, human rights, and ecological factors, were included. Climate change is identified by several reports and studies as a threat to security, and what is more, as a threat multiplier. In words of the High Representative and the European Commission, climate change is a threat multiplier which exacerbates existing trends, tensions, and instability. And according to the ICPP, human security in the context of climate change is defined as a condition that exists when the vital core of human life is protected and when people have the freedom and capacity to live with dignity. Climate change does affect human beings in a wide range of areas, from access to food and clean drinking water to territorial integrity, right to housing and right to health. And these basic needs deprivation may lead to an increase of migration, instability, and conflict, or may exacerbate those challenges already faced. In this roundtable, we will focus on how those impacts lead to displacement and migration to the so-called new climate migrants, even if I am not sure if they are so new. I will not speak anymore. There are many problems and questions, but I think I will leave them for the end. And I will give the way to the expert. And first of all, I will say it's a luxury to have in this table with us Amalie Tower. She's a very experienced humanitarian and human rights professional, and she was founder of Climate Refugee, which over 70 years experience protecting the right of refugees and forcibly displaced population in refugee camps and urban contexts all around the world. She has campaigned with NGO, has a very wide policy experience, always fighting for the right of displaced people, refugee and asylum protection, resettled refugees, and she has done an incredible work, and I must say I have learned a lot from the reports they have published. So whenever you want, Amalie is the roof.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the World Forum for Democracy, the Council of Europe, and all the organizers for this great event and this gracious invitation. As Carolina said, I run an organization called Climate Refugees, focused on creating awareness, mobilizing action, and bringing a field-driven perspective to this conversation that looks at the impacts of climate change, that the impacts has on forced migration. And as she said, I have worked for 17 years or so in human rights and humanitarian contexts in refugee protection. And this has been with the UN Refugee Agency, with the US government's refugee admissions programs, and also with various NGOs all around the world. Now, with that said, I can tell you from those years of field experience and hearing refugee testimonies, for most of the world, climate change and migration isn't just an environmental issue. Yes, human mobility is part of our human history for exploration, advancement, and even adaptation, which is something you'll often hear about when we discuss climate migration today. There's a lot of conversation, rightly so, from researchers, geographers, and experts in this field that will discuss migration, in its historical context and in its right and appropriate context. But what I'm talking about, and what many of us advocates are talking about, is the need to discuss climate change impacts in terms of forced migration. Determining voluntary versus involuntary migration is easier in situations of conflict or gross human rights violations. And of course, we have, laws in place that sort of determine the protections for those such kinds of movements. We are also able to distinguish, easily between voluntary and involuntary movements where sudden onset disasters occur. Because again, this is not so politically contested, and this is obviously very easy to see and understand. So right now we have global actions that are about building people's resilience, their adaptation to climate change effects, and yes, migration can be a tool of adaptation in that context. But in context of climate change and forced migration, legal gaps do exist, and people are on the move, both internally and across the borders of their own countries, for various reasons, from multi-causal, reasons, and climate change certainly is among those. But what we don't have are criteria to distinguish between voluntary and forced migration, and rights related then to people's admission and stay in foreign countries, right? And their residency then in countries other than their own. And ongoing distinctions in their legal status then when they are in those countries, whether that be on a temporary, permanent, we even have these kinds of bases. So in the absence of that, the gray zone between voluntary and involuntary migration does not excuse inaction or poor public policy formation. And ongoing planning through adaptation strategies, safe and dignified pathways, investment in prevention and mitigation efforts, and even the stalled conversations on compensation for loss and damage need to be reflective then of the range of drivers and human rights realities that propel migration. Climate migration across borders, as I said, is multi-causal. And what do I mean by that? That means that it's influenced by many factors like population and demographics, cultural, political, socioeconomic realities. And I would add that these multi-causal factors I just mentioned exist in refugee movements as well. That's very emblematic of just human movement in general. But the reality is that extreme weather is the world's leading cause of forced displacement today. So by extreme weather, we're talking about droughts, wildfires, the hurricanes that we're seeing, the cyclones, I think you all know what they are. The extreme weather events that now displace people, an average of 21.5 million people every year over the past decade. So these weather events then are what we refer to as sudden onset and slow onset effects of climate change. The slow onset effects, for example, will be like desertifications and droughts. Now, the majority of climate migrants will move internally. That's not unusual. And as with even like conflict and gross human rights violations, it's not uncommon to see the displaced persons, internally displaced persons sometimes be a higher number than even refugee outflows. And that would be people who have crossed borders. But it's important we realize then, just like with IDPs and refugees in conflict scenarios, moving across an international border doesn't mean there isn't a forced element and that there isn't an underlying protection need. Now, I founded Climate Refugees in 2015 after years of work in the refugee protection field, as I said, but also because I heard years of stories from refugees who spoke of environmental devastation more than even the conflicts at home. And at the time, I would find this sort of to be a frustrating conversation because I was really trying to, form a refugee claim in my conversations with them. But in reality, looking back on it all now, they were really telling us something quite significant about climate change and so much more. The populations most impacted by the risks climate change pose are those living on the margins of society due to long entrenched systemic and structural inequalities. Those inequalities have impacted development opportunities, and now in some cases, climate change effects push those development gains back many, many more years. Most of these populations are minority communities amongst us and countries in the global south, who contributed very little to the problem, but pay a disproportionate price for climate change impacts. So when years of drought, desertification, and rainfall variations impact the livelihoods and mere survival of herdsmen and farmers in the Lake Chad, a place that I went to document these impacts, I would say it's not a voluntary movement when they have to move in search of resources to survive. It's also not an environmental issue then. In fact, it worsens issues ongoing in the Sahel of underdevelopment, limited natural resources, and political and religious tensions. That forced migration also threatens a vast array of human rights. A 2019 Parliamentary Assembly resolution of the Council of Europe noted that the absence of a legally binding definition of climate refugees, and they actually use that term, does not preclude the possibility of developing specific policies to protect people who are forced to move as a consequence of climate change. It further called on member states to develop in their asylum systems and in international law protection for people fleeing long-term climate change in their native countries. The industrialized member states of the Council of Europe carry, they said, a particular responsibility to those countries, especially the countries of the global south. Affected by man-made climate change and should therefore provide appropriate asylum for climate refugees. And I think this is an incredibly bold, welcome, and spot-on resolution. Unfortunately, it's non-binding, but this is fantastic that the Assembly did have actually state these words. Now, last year, the UN Human Rights Committee upheld the principle of non-refoulement, which is the cornerstone of refugee law, ruling that states could not deport individuals who faced climate change-induced conditions that violate the right to life. And they based this on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Last month, a French court ruled in favor of a Bangladeshi migrant, ruling that the environment, that is the air pollution in his country, made it unsafe for him to be returned back to his country. And then in a recent legal paper, UNHCR, that's the Refugee Agency, pointed to a range of human rights violations that could result from climate change and disasters that could amount to persecution under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, going back to that Lake Chad example that I shared, in a place that I visited and conducted a field report on, UNHCR also noted that adverse effects of climate change could impact certain individuals. So like marginalized, vulnerable, those dependent on natural resources, indigenous communities, basically those disproportionately affected may have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of the discriminatory nature in which they may not have access then to resources or may feel the impacts of those climate change effects. Ultimately, then, what these legal developments show is the importance of human rights law in enforcing and fomenting linkages and pathways that solidify the impacts of climate change. It points to how little human rights have been at the heart of the discussions thus far and how much it needs to drive the conversation. Most importantly, it points to avenues that would allow voice for the most affected people to be heard and have a meaningful opportunity to influence policy. I will close by saying that we need leadership to close the gaps in international protection. The recent developments in the UN, UNHCR considerations, case law, and the interest in tackling climate migration by the new administration here in the United States, that being the Biden administration, even in terms of looking at climate change and migration, and then even asking for options for protection and resettlement, is incredibly bold and innovative and incredibly welcome by me, by members of civil society and advocates that certainly are on this end of the table. It's also a signal of political will, I hope, that will materialize and transcend boundaries to meet the risks of a changed climate and a world that's very much out of step with those needs. I'll close there so we can have a really meaningful conversation, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Tivali. I couldn't agree more with you. What extraordinary presentation. The principle of non-refoulement as the core of protection, and the implementation of human rights as the best way to try to protect the most vulnerable, that are also and double vulnerable because of the consequences of this climate change. We will leave the questions arise for the final debate. And now is Dr. Beatriz Felipe Turn. She is a PhD in law with an international mention and Miguel Prats Award for the best thesis in environmental law in 2016 from the Spanish University, a Catalonian university, Rovira and Virgili University. And she is also an associate researcher at the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law Studies. She is graduated in environment sciences from the University of Granada, also in Spain. And she studied a master's degree in environmental law and a postgraduate degree in international cooperation and development. So I think she's going to help us and she's going to give us a perfect speech about the problems of climate change related to human rights, migration, and international cooperation. Thank you very much, Beatriz. Whenever you want, you have the word.
Thank you, Ángeles. It's a pleasure for me to be here this evening with all of you. It's also a pleasure to speak after Amali because she gave such a wonderful introduction and I love her organization. Maybe later we can talk a little bit more about it because I think they are working a lot in raising awareness on this topic, which is something really, really relevant these days. Also, I wanted to say thank you to Shivani and Andres for organizing this event, because I've read that they are students, and I'm always happy when I see that students are kind of looking forward to organize this sort of event. So congratulations, and thank you again for inviting me. So as Amali, I am part of Migraciones Climáticas, which is something like Amali's institution, but in Spain. And in case you are interested, you can visit the website, is migracionesclimáticas.org, and it's a Spanish platform aimed also at raising awareness on climate migration. We work on different perspectives. Every year we publish a report on different issues also related to climate migration. And we also have a blog that I'm particularly proud of it, because we invite different experts of the world which are working on climate migration, and we ask them to write short pieces on this topic, and also in a language that most of the people can understand. So I like it a lot, because I think it get this topic that sometimes can be difficult to understand to a big audience, and a lot of people can read about it. So in this presentation today, as I knew that Amali was going to talk about human rights and the legal protection or misprotection of climate migrants, I will focus on the gender perspective of this issue. So, as it was explained in the previous panel, we know that the climate crisis is a major threat with implications for the whole planet. Its adverse effects are increasingly severe, and they are happening faster than we feared, especially in the global south, as Amali already mentioned. And we should keep in mind that the global south is responsible for less than 4% of climate change causing greenhouse gases. However, climate-induced migration is mainly taking place in these countries. We are witnessing sea level rising, the Arctic melting, forests and other ecosystems burning, and biodiversity decreasing. 2 days ago, I don't know if you read about it, but there was a very, very hard flash flood occurring in India, inundating a dam project site where 152 people were working. A glacial lake collapsed, provoking the flood, because there were pockets of meltwater within the glacier caused by the warmest January in this region in 6 years. So this was a climate disaster, but we always have to keep in mind that it's not climate change in an abstract sense, that it's humans who are creating this climate change. And it's not only climate change, it's also the policies and how we build stuff, right? Because in this case, for example, there were intensive buildings along the region, rivers and mountains of dams and hydroelectricity infrastructure. So, although environmental degradation has induced human mobility in the past, the current situation, defined by the effects of climate change, is unprecedented. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center estimates that disasters displaced around 24.9 million people in 2009, which is almost 3 times the number of people who fled conflict and violence. There is widespread agreement that people in vulnerable situations, such as women and girls in the global south, are suffering the worst consequences. As we analyzed in our report from 2019, Las migraciones climáticas desde una perspectiva de género, Climate Migration from a Gender Perspective, published by ECODES and with the support of SDO Comunicación and the platform Migraciones Climáticas, and it is also reflected on CARE International's report and many other papers. The climate crisis, sorry for the bells, and there is a church near my house and it rings, it stops, sorry for that. So as we said in our report, we found out that the climate crisis exacerbates gender inequality and makes it harder to achieve gender justice. Climate change may not only directly impact women through environmental changes such as rise in sea level or increase in temperature, but also make them more vulnerable because of its interaction with socio-cultural factors. On average, women tend to be poorer, less educated, have a lower health status, and have limited direct access to or ownership of natural resources. Regarding climate migration in particular, the experiences, needs, and priorities of climate migrants also vary by gender. Social and cultural conditions and gender norms influence access to and control over resources, and we should also keep in mind the division of labor. Let's think now on one of the most relevant effects of climate change, that is increased water scarcity, right? So, as you may know, in many countries, women and girls are the primary providers of water. As women are mainly responsible of gathering water for the household, water scarcity means that they will have to work harder, not only walking bigger distance to get the water, but it means that they have less time to work on paid jobs, less time for education, and many other indirect impacts. Women also do most of the subsistence farming in certain countries, and climate change will negatively impact food production. Scarcity of food can worsen women's nutritional status due to their marginalization within households, and it often happens that women feed their children and husband first. This has been shown, for example, in Inspire Action's report from 2019, that they were doing a research on how climate migration and gender interact in Central America. Regarding the health effects, let's think on the migratory process, as it creates unique challenges for women and girls in regard to their reproductive roles as mothers, and have adverse impacts on pregnancy and mental health outcomes. It has also been shown that adverse impacts on pregnancy, and maternal health outcomes. It has also been shown that women tend to suffer more than men from the psychological impacts of migration, as they are asked with taking care of family members while disregarding their own distress. This condition often leads to women suffer from anxiety and post-traumatic stress. Regarding disaster disproportionately affect those already living in poverty. Thus, we need to keep in our mind that the global feminization of poverty. Disasters have disproportionate effects on women across the globe and tend to leave poor women living in more impoverished situations, especially when women's incomes are resource dependent. Now think about decision making. When to migrate, where, how, who will migrate. We need to think that gender norms in regions of origin also affect migration decision making. Women usually have less control over the decision to migrate than men. Cultural norms, gender roles, and unequal migration policies may limit women's and men's ability to migrate. In some regions, women household members are more likely to migrate, while in other regions it is men who typically move. In some regions, due to traditional roles, women and girls often have an unequal and demanding responsibility to care for children and for the elderly, which makes it harder and more difficult to leave home. However, when men leave, women's workload increases. Women do take up traditional male roles, but without getting the same rights. For example, participation in natural resource management. All these tasks reduce women's access to get paid work or to attend school. Sometimes, wives of migrant workers have reported increased workloads and felt less support as a result of their husband's absence. They also face discrimination as a female-headed household. However, it has also been proved that when women migrate, the situation is not the same for the men who stay behind, as most of them, they don't take the labor, they don't do the activities that were carried out by the women who left, but by the female members of the families. Female relatives of migrant women are often relied upon to take over the unpaid care work of their left behind families. This is the global care chain. Women displaced by disasters and the adverse effect of climate change also face increased risk of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, forced marriage, and trafficking. Women and girls in the Philippines, for example, were already vulnerable to sexual violence and trafficking due to high rates in poverty. But it has been shown that in the aftermath of the Typhoon Haiyan, eh, more than 5,000 women were exposed to sexual violence. Let's think now, and I'm almost finishing, on the situation of the temporary shelters used on the aftermath of the disasters. Too often in emergency responses and recovery, women's and girls' unique needs are not treated with the same urgency as issues like shelter, water, or food aid. This condition often leads to women suffer from anxiety and stress, which are also some of the consequences of sexual violence on women in camps of displaced people. Additionally, women and children are more vulnerable to attack or abuse, particularly after attack when they need to use the latrine in communal facilities in camps. To finalize, just to say that on the post-migration stage in the new place, integration is also experienced differently by women and men depending on various factors, amongst which their inclusion in the job market and the impact of migration on their status. Despite women's increased occupation in the new place can trigger a change of gender roles within the household, it does not always result in more equally within the household, as women can easily find themselves having two jobs and plus the one inside the house, which is usually unpaid. Migration certainly changes gender roles, but the outcomes might not always be positive. In order to conclude my presentation, I think that it is also relevant to point out that women are also on the front lines when it comes to combating climate change and also in developing adaptation measures and also organizing climate-induced resettlement, for example. They help to protect over the food and nutrition security of their families and communities and play a critical role in overcoming the challenges of the climate crisis. Women must have a central role as change agents in the design, implementation, and evaluation of solutions for climate migration. It is important to highlight the huge potential of female agency, as climate migration is a matter of climate, migrant, and also gender justice. And that's all from me. Thank you a lot, and I hope later we can discuss a little bit further.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beatriz Felipe. And as I have said before, we are going to leave all the questions for the end after this suggestive and interesting presentation showing women not only as a vulnerable group, but also as a main actor against climate change. And I think that's a very accurate position. I think I agree with you. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to say. We are not going to have any discussion because I agree with all your words. Now is the turn of the executive director at UNICEF Spain, Javier Martos. Hello, Javier. Pleased to see you after so many years. Javier Martos has developed his professional career in the field of development cooperation, linked to fundraising action and development of awareness programs. After several years in direct management of cooperation programs, he assumed functions of executive direction, managing the resources of the Spanish Committee of UNICEF in order to achieve the best contribution to UNICEF funds and promoting plans and projects to improve the condition of life of children in all countries. So I think you're going to talk about children. You have the floor, Javier.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about children, migration, and also climate change, that for us now is a big priority in the organization. I'm going to try to share with you a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation that I think that can help us to follow up my presentation, but I'm not sure that I can do it.
Andrés y Sivani pueden ayudarte, creo. They can help you, sorry. Sivani, Andrés, are you here?
I think he's the moderator. You can do it. You can do it, okay. Mark, Javier, you can do it.
I think it's working, no?
Yes, I think it's going to, we're going to see it. It's uploading, yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Javier, because it could be really helpful. Well, I would like to share with you that we have two pillars in our work in UNICEF now. The first pillar, for course, is SDGs, that is so important in all our work. And especially now that this agenda is fantastic because it's working in the north, in the high-income countries, and also in the south, in middle-income country, and also is working, trying to have a common perspective about the economic field, the social field, and finally the environmental perspective that is so important in this context, because now we are facing problems in the social side, in the economic side, and also in the environmental side. And also following the pandemic, no? Because it's so difficult to not to follow up what is going on with the pandemic in the north and the south. Now, for example, we are working so hard trying to bring vaccination to the south because now, for example, doctor, social services, they are not receiving the vaccine, and we are going to face economic problems and social problems if we don't have the capacity by the cooperation for development and also trying to have the support of the private sector to give and to provide vaccination in the south. One of them is the SDG, and the second is the Children Rights Convention that it was approved in 1989. And the Convention of Children's Rights, the most important message for the adults is that children has the capacity to give opinion and to participate, and they are citizens. Of course, they don't have all the rights because they are studying, they don't have all the capacity like adults, but in the sense is trying to build democracy. And democracy is so important when you are talking about climate change as well. Because children, for example, they are really worried about what is going on. They are participating and they are showing that they have the capacity to change the rules and to push governments, multilateral institutions. They have a big role about climate change and also in the north and in the south. That is a new movement, and we are really proud that all the adolescents and young people that are fighting against the economic field and also all the rules that are pushing and they are putting the world in this situation. We have four pillars, four developments about the rights: survival, of course, health, water and sanitation; development, education, formal and not formal, that is so important for the world; protection, violence against children, child labor, migration also, because the most vulnerable children are on the move. Now, for example, we have in our country a big problem with in Canary Island, and now many NGOs and UNICEF are working together with the Spanish government and with the regional government, trying to bring children coming from Canary Island to the continent, to Madrid and other region in the state, trying to protect their children, because as you know, we can see that in Canary Island we have big problem because our capacities there to protect the migrant children are less than in other parts of the country, because they have a lot of pressure coming from the people who are coming to Canary Island. Participation, that is so important, because if we want to change our mind as adults, because many times we are thinking that the governments and the local authorities they need to change, but the message and the mandate behind this Children's Rights Convention is that all the adults need to change, because we need to recognize the young people and the adolescents, because they can do a lot of things, but the barrier, the frontier, is not only in the authorities, it's also about the adults. And now we have a big question that is on the table, and we are working together with other NGOs. How is the pandemic and the climate crisis affecting children's rights? Because we can see that the education, in many countries, we have all the schools closed. Even in Europe, we can see that in many countries, we don't have enough resources to media and to have also digital capacities to provide education for all children. We can see also big disparities among all the children in the north and in the south. And also we are facing new problems behind also the pandemic. I could see hoy in the TV news in Spain that, for example, in France, in Paris, in many other places in the world, students in the university need to have support coming from the authorities about housing or food because they don't have enough capacities. And now I know that in France, many restaurants are closed. They don't have the capacity to work. We are facing new problems and we need to have a different perspective about the situation before the pandemic 2 years ago. Talking about climate change and childhood, I think that it is growing an unprecedented threat, social, economic, and environmental impacts around the world, although with different intensity and scope. We can see that the Sahel is really different than the North. In the Sahel, they have a strong pressure about the capacities that the agriculture and also they don't have enough water. It's really different than in other countries, but in any case, we can see that. And also, worldwide, more than 88 of disease by climate change occur in children under 5. The most vulnerable people now in the world about talking about climate change are children. Are small children because they don't have enough capacities that have adults and young people to face these kind of problems because they have, for example, pneumonia, other disease that affect them more than adults. Some figures and days about who has the less responsibility and are the most affected, children. 4 out of 5 climate change disease are suffered by children. Pneumonia is a clear example. 175 million children will be affected by disease coming by the climate change. Mongolia is an example about that. In Mongolia, they have many days by year that they cannot go to the school because the pollution. And it's a problem that is affecting the children's right to be educated. And we can see these things and example around the world. The reduction in agricultural production will leave almost 95,000 additional deaths on children under 5 of age due to malnutrition each year by 2030. That is a clear example that we have and we are facing big problem also about nutrition. That is also a very important issue around the world, even behind the pandemic. Now we can see that, for example, the cereals market is suffering. We don't have enough production to fix the demand, and we are going to have problem in the south, especially in Africa, but not only in other areas of the world, following that we don't have enough production in cereals, of course, by the pandemic, but also for other problems that we are having in the world, especially because we don't have, and I think that we don't have the right position about what is going on in the agricultural side and is following the capitalists and not thinking in a different way. This is a slide to explain that the children are not in the same position than us to face and to deal with this kind of problem. Children are affected by the production on the extraction of production of food, goods and services, effect of environmental degradation and climate change, extreme heart, effects on natural systems. And this is happening in many countries in the world. And we can see that this is fueling and producing new developments about migration. Of course, we are thinking that in the north, we are thinking all the problems are related to the economic field, that they are looking for any opportunities in other countries, but this is not the real. And in many occasions, they are thinking that the best option to deal with this kind of thing is leaving the country and thinking and looking for new opportunities in other countries. And I would like also to put on the table that this climate change problem is not only affecting the South, that we have this problem in our country and another European country. Spain could increase the temperature by 5 degrees by 2050, with the consequent effect on our economy. It will affect the agricultural sector and tourist sector, plus 12% of the country GDP, rising sea level, impact on infrastructure and population, more heat and cold waves, more extreme temperatures, increased disease and mortality. And we are facing the same problem because it's impossible to build and to have frontiers a barrier talking about climate change and children. Less access to water. We have been suffering dry season for many, many years. This season is really different, maybe because we have been producing less than other years. 2020 loss of about 20 of the water resources that we have in 1990, increasing diseases, diarrhea, and water stress. These kind of problems are affecting our children, and probably in the future we are going to have. And finally, I would like to share with you this picture coming from Madrid and the COP25. And you can see that the young people, the adolescents, they have a strong commitment about that. When you produce a survey about climate change, nature, and talking with young people, you can see that this is a core problem for them. In every single survey in our country and in other countries around the world, the climate change is in the core of the young people agenda. And in this case, I think that we need to follow their ideas, that we need to support these people who are putting on the table that this is a big problem and we need to have the responsibility to change our mind different way and follow up the SDGs that for me is a fantastic agenda, and we have a big opportunity to change our mind and the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. You have talked about the children, as I expected, but also about SDG, and I think that's also a very important topic and very related with climate change. Thank you very much. And now it's my turn because I'm moderator and I have to say something. You have put me in a very hard situation because you have said almost all the things I wanted to speak of. So I'm going to underline, if you don't mind, some ideas. I'm going to be very short. First of all, I think the basis, and I have already linked migration and human security, I think that's a very important perspective and point of view. And of course, it means human rights and democracy and rule of law. Second, that climate factors have already been linked with migration flows, but have always existed, yes. But the dimension of the problem today is completely different and much more serious because of the quantity of migration flows and also because of the effects of those climate factors. Amalia has already said migration, considered by experts as an adaptive measure to current and future climate change effects. Nevertheless, the chance to migrate depends on the resources available to do so. And many times, and it has already been underlined, those who are the most vulnerable are not able to migrate. And we have heard children and women are one of the most vulnerable. And I would like to underline another very vulnerable group, and that is indigenous people. In the case of indigenous peoples, the relation and dependence on the environment and its resources, it's very strong. And in addition, some indigenous people are located in regions where climate change have direct impacts, what increases their vulnerability. In the first roundtable, they have talked about the Arctic and the polar bears and the Inuit, so it's sometimes a very controversial issue. But it's true that they face obstacles when enjoying their human rights, obstacles that are magnified on the grounds of climate change impact. The right, as it happens with women, to housing, food, water, self-determination, land, or culture would be or could be undermined by the adverse effects of climate change, with very negatively influences in the fragile ecosystems where they live. And this negative impact may be very depending on the location and ecosystem, as do the rights affected. For example, the indigenous group settled in the Andes faces the problem on how the changes affecting the snowpack, which directly raise the right to water. And in the Arctic, the warming and diminishing ice, and so on and so on, and Amazonia, other different problems. And the situation of the Inuits, or the invasion of exotic insects and of fish, birds, and changing all the ecosystems. Not only climate change, but also those measures taken to mitigate and prevent it endanger ecosystems upon which many indigenous people rely for housing and practice. Poverty is the other factor that increases the impact of climate change, either on poor people or on poor countries, the global south you have been talking about. And they are expected to suffer greater risks in comparison with rich countries due to the different grounds, including the fact that their economies are often close, linked with natural resources. And in short, negative impact of climate change will increase and will affect disproportionately to individuals in vulnerable situations in different ways. And finally, my fifth idea, the current international protection regimes for the different categories of migrants that, as Amalia has already said, do not seem to be enough or sufficient or adequate for this new reality. And we do have a problem, because to protect a group, we need to identify correctly the victims and those and how those victims are going to be protected by law. And in the case of climate migrants, and afterwards I will ask Beatriz and Amali if they have chosen climate migrants, but I don't know why they reject environmental migrants. Anyway, it has already been said, those migrants, most of them stay in their own country. So what we are talking about is internal displaced people, and they need protection. And some other cross borders, and they could be migrants, or they could be considered environmental refugees or disaster displaced persons. So there are different terms, because every term is linked to a kind or a regime, an international protection regime, and none of them focus particularly on the needs of those displaced migrant persons, forcibly or unforcibly, because the frontier, the border between voluntary and involuntary migration, I think it's very hard to establish. And that's why I think when there have been or scholars, academia tries to find different solutions to cover this gap. And some of those provided by scholars have talked about reformation of the current status refugee to the introduction of a new international figure of protection. The first proposal, the one of the revision of the 1951 Refugee Convention, including the criteria of the status of refugee, climate or environmental impact, I think it's not going to work. If we are going to touch this convention, we are going to lose protection, not to gain a wider number of people protected by it. So I think it's not a good a good way to go on. The second option could be to address root causes and provide for a temporal protection. I don't think it's a very realistic approach, but I will be I want to hear what you think about it, since in many cases we are facing irreversible process. So a temporal protection will not really solve the problem. And in addition, to address such causes would imply an immediate and radical change in production and society behavior. And this is not really realistic in a short time period. There was another proposal posed by the World Bank. That's the creation of a new climate change refugee legal instrument that would comprise a whole wide range of areas in relation with climate change. That could be wonderful if we are able to achieve it. But I don't know if politicians, governments, and populations are ready to assume legal compulsory obligations related to climate change and protection of people. So at present, I think our best tools, and I think Amalia has said the same idea, is that we use what we have. And we have human rights, international conventions, and in the core of them, we have this principle of non-refoulement, a principle that has become customary international law that applies far beyond the original convention and that many scholars may consider constitutes a new use coherent rules. And under this principle, a country is prevented from expelling or returning a person if this person is going to comfort certain dangers, persecution, or the consequences of this climate change. And I think in this case, the judgment of the Deitota case is also very, very important. So I think the most important way of doing today is trying to save and to guarantee the enjoyment of human rights, that everyone, everybody, everywhere has the right to enjoy them wherever they are found. So if states accept to really protect those who are in their territory, would help to protect those climate, environment, refugee migrants. The problem is, how are they going to enter the territory of other countries with legally? And that's one of the main arguments of states not to protect those who are found or those who are irregularly in their territories. So I'm going to finish with a not so optimistic point of view, and I think we can start talking or asking whoever wants to initiate this debate. Thank you very much for listening to me. If no one wants to ask, I would like to ask Amalia and Beatriz, why climate migrants and not environmental migrants? Because both of your organizations talk about climate, and I think environmental may be more omnicomprehensive of the many problems that are there. So I don't know. I would like to listen to your explanation, because I'm sure you are right, but I rather environmental migrants. I don't know. Amalie, sorry.
Sure. That's a good distinction, and one that hasn't been asked of me before. Let me begin by saying that I think you could think of it two ways. One, whether it's environment or climate, is to look at the driver. Whether it's migrant or refugee or displaced or whatever other term you want to use, is to look at the cause. And both are, so let's look at the cause aspect first. I have an issue with using the term migrant for various reasons. One, migrant actually has no legal definition. So when you're talking about a driver that I think clearly has a forced element to it, whether it's the environment or climate, using the term migrant then is a mistake, because it gives the impression that there's a voluntary aspect to this. And it completely bysteps the very coercive nature of climate change in stripping away people's options, stripping away people's protections, their rights, their abilities to the full enjoyment of human rights, to the full, development of human capacity. It even strips away their very choice of migration as a choice, right? As a right, as mobility, as many of the conversations right now are ongoing. So I think the term migrant, therefore, is very it misconstrues all these realities. The term refugee, on my part, is used very deliberately to propel responsibility, to drive the conversation towards political responsibility. That in the absence of having this conversation, a problem is ongoing that has its roots in certain states bearing a differentiated responsibility. And that's, of course, a reality that's based in international law, that that it is appropriate for certain states to bear a greater response here. Now, whether that greater response, what that looks like in terms of climate change, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different ways that we're having this conversation about political responsibility. But where climate change and migration, displacement, the forced elements of it integrate or intersect, I think we have to force the conversation to say that there is a responsibility here to take up preventative and protective and adaptive responses. Even the whole idea of loss and damage is completely stalled because nobody wants to make any commitments that compensate states for all the ways in which they're impacted, whether it be the development gains, right, that are now lost, whether it be the displacement of its populations, and so on and so forth. So for those purposes, I think, the term refugee, although it has no legal definition that applies in this context, it certainly has a moral and ethical and political imperative for why it applies. As to your first question about climate or environment, I did not come to this from any expertise in terms of, environmentalism. I came to this from the perspective of where was the conversation at the political level. And the political conversation that's ongoing is how man-made impacts of climate change are, impacting then our world in terms of our global system. So that, I think, is really where it's at. And it's interesting to me then that the international community is very sort of wanting to use the term environmental migrants, and if that's the case, well, we have a whole suite of environmental laws as well that, very much support the right to a healthy and safe environment. And that, again, is enshrined in human rights law, and is something that is widely accepted now in a number of states, and you could say is even like jurisprudence at this point. The special rapporteur on human rights and the environment has even provided framework principles, on exactly this right. So, and it's very, very clear that the situation with the environment right now impedes on the right to live, the right to breathe, all the basic functions that we do need around the globe are impacted, are impeded. So if that's the case on one end, then even using the term environmental refugee would be okay with me. You know, it's that second, it's the impacts that I have a problem with in terms of like leaving it as something so banal as migrants, you know, which doesn't encompass really the large-ranging effects and then the large-ranging need for responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much, and I completely agree with you. The term migrant has this sociological sense, but from the international point of view, migration or migrants is the global term, because those voluntary migrants are workers, migrant workers. So, okay, but I think your position is perfectly correct. I mean, refugees is much more referred to responsibility and accountability. And in your case, Elena, Beatriz, sorry.
Thank you. So I have a different opinion about using the term refugee or migration, and I think it's very interesting that we have these two visions on the same thing, because it reflects the big debate that it's still alive on climate migration, climate refugee, or wherever, because I think this is one of the first debates on this topic, and it's still nowadays alive. So I also wanted to say that when I started my PhD on this specific topic, I think I spent like the first year trying to decide which definition I should use, whether I should use climate refugees, environmental refugees, climate migrant, environmental displacement, and you know there is so many definitions to talk about the same actually. In my case, I always use climate migration for many reasons, which are, I don't think climate refugee is not good, but I think it also have some negative related issues. First of all, as my PhD is in law, I found that using a term that it wasn't legally correct wasn't the best thing to do. Also because, as you said, Angeles, I also think that the Geneva Convention should not be tried to be modified. So why to use the term refugee? Also because nowadays most of the movements are taking place inside the countries. So why are we talking about refugees if we are actually talking about people who's moving in the same country? Also because there are some people directly affected by climate change who don't want to be seen by the world as drowning, as refugees. They want to show that they have agency, and they even say this something like, we are not drowning, we are fighting, especially from the small island states, right? So I saw that there were many reasons to don't use that. I also thought that the word migration, it's also, as you said, a synonym of the word human mobility. So it could include refugees, it could include internal displacement, and it's also helpful to see that even if migration is seen as something voluntary, actually most of the times it's not. For example, as Javier was talking about the migration crisis now we have in the Canary Islands. I'm from the Canary Islands. And we talk about migration. Is it voluntary? We are seeing thousands of people in the pateras, almost many of them dying in the Atlantic Ocean. Is this voluntary? So I think this is also why I use migration in such a broad sense. And regarding your first question on the difference between climate change and environmental, this is also a big question, Angeles. The thing is that I was focusing on ways to let me see how can I explain this in English. What I was trying to say is that when there were environmental reasons, for example, the construction of a development project, an earthquake, or for example, an industrial accident, right? Like the typical example, Chernobyl. There you can find easily who was the guilty. You can see that there is a company doing something, right? So this company has to give redress somehow, and it will be difficult, but it will be very, very easy to find who's responsible for this displacement. And there we also have environmental laws. We have the guiding principles on internal displacement. We have the Kampala Convention in Africa, and we have so many legal options to protect these environmentally displaced people. But when it comes to climate change, this nexus is not that clear. We have to go to extraterritorial obligations. So that's why I was focusing only in climate change. But it's not because they are more vulnerable than environmental migrants or environmental displacement. For me, it was just a way to find ways to protect these specific people. And also, well, just because of that.
No, but
Thank you.
you are right. Environmental is more related to natural disasters than to climate change. That's completely right. But if we're talking about how to protect them, I think they should go together because if we don't link climate change to natural disasters, we are going to have a problem. I mean, I think it's going to be harder. So that's why I wasn't sure about it.
Can I can I very quickly just point out a couple of things though that are really important? Beatrice, you're absolutely right about the legal definitions and their, I would say, limitations. Then I certainly don't advocate for a wider expansion of the convention because I think this would completely weaken the 1951 Refugee Convention, where states have a hard enough time,
implemented.
exactly, implementing their legal obligations as it is. So this would be very counterproductive. But let's not forget that I just made some notes as we were speaking. For most of the population, as I was saying in my opening comments, this is not an environmental issue. The impacts of climate change go well beyond the environment. When desertification or droughts impact your ability to impact your livelihoods and then survival, that becomes an economic issue, that becomes a political issue, that becomes entire systems that are impacted. That worsens situations where in countries where underdevelopment, weak institutions, political tensions and such are grossly exacerbated by yet another driver. So this has never been an environmental issue for most of the world, number one. Number two, UNHCR has finally also seen this very important point in its new legal considerations by coming around to recognizing things that a lot of us have already spoken about for years, which is that the convention, doesn't need adopting or widening, but it, as stated right now, it can apply beyond even nexus dynamics, which used to be what the original thinking was. First, people can have a well-founded fear of persecution purely on the basis of not being participatory in adaptation strategies, in resilience. People can have a well-founded fear of persecution because they're marginalized, because of how climate change impacts affect their societies, because of all the gross human rights violations that lead to the marginalization of already marginalized people, so on and so forth. Okay, people move, people migrate. Oh, in my experience, people, by the time I see them as refugees, it is not the first time that they have moved. It is multiple times after they have moved. Most times people are displaced internally in terms of conflict. People are displaced internally when things, continue, protection needs continue to go on being unmet. It's not uncommon for people to move across borders. I do not see how the threats that climate change impose won't be any different if we don't tackle things at a much more fundamental level. Another thing was that the Pacific Islands and what they had to say about what they wanted to be called is always brought up as why we shouldn't be using this term. But we never go beyond what exactly they actually said. They listed a whole list of conditions and things that they felt as a region, as a bloc, that needed to be part of the response. And they were all about adaptation, resilience, support, political support, economic support, compensation. And when those things were not met or inadequate, then they talked about resettlement. And how do we do those things except through protection instruments? Then they talked about what do we do about our population that no longer is going to be able to survive in certain places. So it's interesting to note that it's not that they didn't want the refugee instruments or protection instruments to be used or coined towards them. They were saying, do not resort to this as our first instance of solutions. And the last thing I want to say is that we have always had regional refugee instruments in international law. The Cartagena Declaration, the 1969 OAU Convention, which have much wider definitions of refugee. And that is to say that events that threaten public order. And, you know, I think Latin America and the African states have shown us the way in terms of being more broader and inclusive, and they've done so as well in the guiding principles on internal displacement, forming now the Kampala Convention, which include climate change as a reason for displacement. So for all these reasons, we are, I think, well beyond needing to discuss things beyond just the strict parameters of legal definitions that were formed in 1951 following the political needs that arose out of 1945 in Europe. The world has changed dramatically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Who wants, let me see. I don't see if there was something written, Javier. Sibali, can you see something? I'm unable to
say what? To say what?
No, don't worry. There's no any questions on the chat.
Oh, and Javier, do you have any question?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Martos and his work in UNICEF and the work for the children. I am really worried about the future of the children in the world, not only because of the climate change, no, of course, no. But do you think that there are any specific region on the world that we have to keep in mind in a short future and to be sure that we will have and we will find more problems for children in this short future?
Well, I think that the problem is more related with the pandemic and all effects that we are going to face in the south, in the developing countries, that in one region. Of course, sub-Saharan African they have less resources, especially in social services and health services, to face this kind of problem. But in any case, I think that around the world we are going to have a different world, and the SDG agenda is the mandate. We need to work together, collaborative way, solidarity, and now we have the pandemic. That the most important issue about the pandemic is that if we want to defeat, if we want to have a different world, we need to work together. And now I can see that the North, the nationalists about the vaccination, for example, is a very important issue. We want to vaccinate 3% of the people in the South, especially social worker, teacher, health services. And for us, this is our priority. And I think that we have a big opportunity to work together and to have less barrier, less frontier, and more capacity to have partenariat, to work together, solidarity, and it's intelligent, it's fair, and is so important to have a world free of coronavirus.
Professor Caro, you have the last words and your speakers. You can give their last minute or something like this.
I didn't hear you.
I know
Sorry.
that you have the last minutes. If you want to use to say something and your speakers want to finish with something, and you decide.
Sorry, I have a question, if I could.
Okay. I don't know who you are, but ask your
Andres.
questions. Andres, ask your
Hi,
questions.
Andres.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm here. Sorry. Okay, so my question was for everyone in the round table, because I have been studying that the effects on climate change are not the same for every country. And for example, in Latin America or in Africa, the effects are going to be worse, and the climate migration maybe could be even worse in those places. And like Beatriz said the other time, migration is inside the countries, and maybe the north or the west are not going to, how can we say, are not going to be in that way affected. And I would like to ask everyone if it is possible to include this problem in the West agenda, so that everyone using multilateralism can fix this problem altogether, although the effects are not the same for everyone. Thank you.
I will leave Amalie and Beatriz to answer first, and then I will give my opinion if you want to, if we have time. I don't know if Amalie is still here, if she's able to be here.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if you want, we can answer in the same way we have intervened. Okay. So
Okay.
first, Amalie.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why the West, the powerful global North countries, as it were, can't. I mean, I think that was your question, right? Like, can they all come to a consensus on things that may not impact them as fully or equally? Well, isn't that exactly what our international system's about? That we're all supposed to cohesively burden share and cohesively agree to laws that apply to all of us equally, so that the world system is, because what benefits everybody, right? If we don't all as actors play together, then everybody loses. I mean, that's principally what is at the core of our system, and is principally why I'm challenging these concepts and these thoughts about, as the world changes, we shouldn't be so reluctant to look at our institutions and even our laws that may not necessarily still represent the needs of a very changed environment, if you'll let me use that word in a different context. So so that's one thing. And the second thing is, I think it's naive to think that the West is not going to be impacted. They already are. I mean, they just look what's going on here in North America with the United States and the massive uptick in disasters that have occurred in the last few years, this last 2020 alone. You're seeing people actually internally displaced by the impacts of climate change. You're seeing, upwards of I don't even know, billions of dollars now at this point in what it costs in terms of, the response mechanisms to these disasters, the economic losses. So it is fully within national interest to figure out a far more resilient strategy, but also a more protective capacity for its own citizens. And the concepts that I've spoken about in terms of like vulnerable people being more adversely impacted applies internally as well to, powerful Western nations. It's the immigrant populations, it's the minority communities, it's indigenous communities right here in the United States, Black populations that are feeling these effects and have been for quite a long time now.
Beatriz, do you want to add something? Javier?
I totally agree what Amali just said, and I also think that actually climate justice is specifically looking for that, for putting or saying that there are some countries which have polluted and contributed way more than others, and even if the others are affected, they are also going to be affected. So if we come to climate justice, is exactly that. And actually, the whole UNFCCC multilateral framework and so on is based on this idea that some countries have historical responsibilities and they should do something now for those who are suffering the most. And thank you for your question.
Thank you. Javier?
Nothing to add. Thank you.
No, I will only add that I think it's a topic, is an issue, is already in the international agenda. And for example, I mean, it's not enough, but the Global Migration Compact was an important step. It's not enough, but it means it's really in the international agenda. So we need to work on, but it's already there. And I think that's an optimistic point of view, at least a little step that has been achieved. Absolutely not enough. I mean, we need much more, but a first step. So I would like to thank you very, very much with all my heart, all the speakers, as it has been a pleasure. I have, as always, learned a lot, and I hope we'll be able to meet again, even if it's online meetings. This pandemic has some beneficial effects, and it's the possibility of doing those kind of events online, so we can share positions and talks from different countries. And I cannot finish without agreeing, Sivana, without thanking Sivani and Andres for their collaboration and for doing possible this event, and of course Professor Esguevilla, the core of all these organizations. Thank you to you all, and I hope we will be able to see us soon. Thank you very much.